Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt.
Morning, Stu.
Thrive Deeper, back in the studio, and again beginning a new book, the book of Deuteronomy. And really, this is a period where we see the new generation of the people who had left Egypt, the new generation standing on the edge of the promised land.
That's right.
And Moses really giving them a bit of, initially anyway, a bit of a recap of what's been happening over the last 40 years. So listeners, welcome. Glad that you're with us as we today are looking to cover Deuteronomy, chapter 1 through to chapter 15.
So the importance of the recap, Stu, is because this is, as you say, it's a new generation, and they need a kind of summary of what have we learnt for the last 40 years. And the key idea here is that they're learning something about human nature and their tendency to, because it's interesting because he keeps saying you, this is what you did. So it's interesting.
But it's actually not them because they are the next generation.
Yeah, they are the next generation.
But he's pointing to,
That's right. But this is the language.
People.
It's interesting. This is the sort of language that's used throughout the Bible, even many, many generations later, speaking to subsequent generations, even about this, the Exodus period. It's still you, right?
Yeah.
Because you covers a people. It's making statements about human beings and how we are, essentially. And actually, when we become a part of this people and the illustration that is used of God's people throughout the Old Testament, this idea of a vine, and you see even Jesus uses that idea of us being part of a vine that sort of stretches back, and that's a kind of standard picture of God's people. There's a sense in which we're part of this vine, we're part of this story, and even for us, I think we can read this and own this and say, no, there's a we here. We are included in this. And we need to read this and learn about ourselves and our own nature and our own tendency to waywardness. But most importantly, what this shows, this recap of history shows, is actually God's continual grace and faithfulness to his people despite their unfaithfulness. And that also then gives them hope for the future.
Yeah. It's kind of a covenant renewal almost, that calls Israel, the people, as you say, to remember what the Lord had done. And because some of them, many of them, most of them weren't there during a lot of what happened there, it allows them then to decide to respond with trust. And faith.
That's right. So that's the first three chapters. The first three chapters is essentially repeating what we read in Exodus and mainly the book of Numbers, in fact. And then we come to chapter 4 and we have this continual exhortation here, and the Hebrew word there is shema.
Yes.
And it's a very important term because it's a command to heed, not just to hear as in listen in an auditory sense, but to actually heed. And in a sense, this takes the form of a kind of something like a formal treaty that would have been made in ancient times. There would have been a declaration, to the parties, here the terms of the covenant. So the idea of a shema, of moment, is not unknown to this people. And the importance of God adopting that is that he is acting as their sovereign Lord, because there were also that form of treaty between a sovereign and a vassal. This is framed in a way that they can kind of understand, although, as we'll see a little further on, he's going to explicitly say to them that you are adopted as God's children. You are God's children. So it's not just, we shouldn't think of it just in terms of political or just they're just servants or,
So essentially it's the hear and do. It's not just the hear.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like we've got to act on what we hear.
Yeah, and the reason is given in chapter 4. The reason for, in a sense, I guess you could say their existence. I mean, it's as a people, it's probably, we shouldn't reduce this to a pragmatic reason, really, because, God chose them because he chose them and because he set his love upon them and so forth. But it says in verse 6, observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great to have their gods near them the way that the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to them? So this is the idea of Israel being a light to the nations.
Yeah.
So this is why it's not just for them and their well-being that they've got to do these things. No, they've got to embody something and reflect God to the nations, right? They bear the name of God, and they've got to reflect. So we're, as human beings, in the beginning, we were created to reflect the image of God. And this is what Israel are to do corporately. They're to declare something and show something to the watching world. So that, again, that's an idea that's picked up. It's amazing reading the Deuteronomy, lest you think this is just a law for an Old Testament people. I'm struck by how much of this is, pretty much all of it everything is carried through. I mean, Jesus says, I've not come to remove the slightest stroke from the law.
Yes.
So in principle, all of this carries through, but particularly this idea, Stu, of God's people being a light to the world. This is set up right here at the start.
There's a bit in there too about idolatry, because that was a big issue, obviously, for the Israelites as they travelled through the wilderness there. And it interested me how much the highlight was that Israel saw no form at Horeb.
Yeah.
And so not to try to make things that you're going to worship. This is what faith is. You heard my voice, you saw my actions. Yeah, you haven't seen me, but you need to just trust me.
Yeah, it's funny we don't connect with that as much. Because he keeps telling them that, doesn't he? You saw no form.
Yeah.
Well, actually,
I think in many ways, God, just show up and then I'll believe you're here.
Yeah,
I think
that's
we
true.
want that all
true.
the time,
Yeah, we want a form. We want something tangible to tell us that God's with us. That's a good point. And so therefore, the exhortation here is there are constant exhortations to remember, the word remember again and again and again.
Yeah.
Don't forget, remember, don't forget, remember. Because the likelihood is that they are going to be enticed by religions that offer them forms and tangibility.
Yes.
There are forms of faith, and you're very right, Stu. Like, even now we can drift into ways of believing that rely on some form of tangible sort of evidence and we can pursue the tangible rather than actually seeking the face of the God who has no tangible form.
Yeah. And
for his own sake.
I think we do that even outside of the faith domain, in the sense that we're looking for something to fulfill us, and instead of turning to God, we tend to buy that fancy car or whatever that idol might be in our lives. It takes the place that God should take. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that the reason God sees idolatry as such a major, major issue is because the covenant is a relational one. It's not just a legal one. It's not just a legal agreement. It's actually a relational one. It's like, as we see later in the Old Testament, committing adultery against God, essentially.
And that is the key note really throughout this, isn't it? It's that relational sense, which is why idolatry is constantly, and I would say that is the thing throughout this book. Choosing other things over God, idolatry is a key theme throughout the book of Deuteronomy because of that relational element. He doesn't just want, kind of box ticking, ritualistic or even moral obedience. He actually wants relationship. So throughout this book, as we're going to see, there are exhortations to do these things and follow these things with all your heart. I mean, they're constant references to the heart. And of course, the famous exhortation, chapter 6, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. But there's a realism here because throughout this, of course, God knows that they are going to be enticed.
Yes.
And so he warns them beforehand, if you get enticed away from this relationship, there's a sense in which you come out from under the covering. Think of Psalm 91, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. And Psalm 91 is a psalm of the protection that we have under the shadow of the Almighty. But when we come out from under that shadow, we come out from under that protection. He warns them of that. But he says in chapter 4 and verse 29, but if from there, right, from your place of being scattered, and even in Deuteronomy, you get this warning about exile.
Yes,
essentially.
You do.
Now, that's already a theme that we know about because, of course, Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, and then Cain was exiled to the east.
There are people familiar with exile.
So the idea of exile has kind of been sort of laid down or preempted in some ways. But already here it says, but if from there, from being when you're in exile, if you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. And there it is. The focus on the heart is important also, Stu, by the way that it contrasts all of the other religions of the ancient world, which were actually all about just offering the right rituals, doing the right things. But this goes much deeper. This is a very deep and deeply personal relationship that God is calling for. So he reminds them of their uniqueness. Verse 32, ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire as you have and lived? And the importance of this, Stu, is that this isn't based on distant myths from long ago,
No, that's
or
right.
This isn't based on just a claim of some individual king to have received a law from God or something like that. As a people, something actually has happened in their midst. I mean, they have together experienced something remarkable that has never been experienced before. So right from the start, the biblical revelation is based in the fact that God did things in history. These are not just stories. This is the historical basis of the biblical faith is so important because God did things with this people as a people, not even just with one individual. It wasn't just with Moses, and everything's based on that.
Now, just before you move on, probably something we should have said a little earlier is just remember that these people were chosen not because God just went, you guys. It came from Abraham and the promise from Abraham all the way down to where we are now with these people. And the second thing is Moses is now realizing that they're about to go across to the promised land and he's not. Point. So he's trying to make sure everything that he's heard from God and learned from God, he's reminding them of because he knows he's got to lay a foundation now that they're going to need to be able to springboard off without him being there any longer.
That's right. This is the final sermon of Moses.
Yes.
That's an important way, I think, to think about the book of Deuteronomy. That's right. He's sending them into the land. He's not going in, but this is his final exhortation. When I say his, this is God speaking through. This is him acting as prophet. So we have this sort of formal, at the end of chapter 4, we have this formal introduction to the repetition of the law. And of course, the name Deuteronomy comes from two Greek words, deutero, second, and nomos, law. Okay, so it's the second giving of the law because we have a second generation and he's giving them the law. Now, the interesting thing, it's not pure repetition, Stu, because there's much more heart in this. There's much more emphasis on the heart.
Yes. I think because Moses realizes that while he was going to be around, he could wave the stick. But now he's not going to be around to wave the stick, in a sense.
But also he knows
he needs to change their heart position.
Yeah, that's right.
Because that's going to have longevity.
Yeah, realistically, people are. It's not just the threat of punishment that is going to cause this people to walk with God. No, it's a change of heart, and so that's the consistent emphasis throughout the book of Deuteronomy. So it says, "This is the law Moses set before the Israelites. These are the stipulations, decrees, and laws Moses gave them when they came out of Egypt." So we have immediately, as we would expect, after that, we have a repetition of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5.
And important, Moses does say, look, these aren't just for us today or the previous generation, our fathers.
Yeah.
This is for everyone. This is future as well as present tense.
Yeah, that's right. And so he goes through, he repeats the 10 Commandments and reminds them, just remember, this is God gave us these commandments. This is not me. Yeah. He spoke to you out of the fire and so forth. So this flows into chapter 6, which is the famous Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? There is one true sovereign God. So therefore, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And that in a sense is this, as even, as Jesus points out, that is the summation of all of the law. And it also brings that relational element as well. God is looking for a relationship here. Now, the concern in the book of Deuteronomy is multi-generational obedience. So he says, these commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. There it is. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Now, our children know what's most important to us.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So he's saying your children are observing you, and what you do is going to carry through to the next generation. This is why, again, one of the constant exhortations is be careful, watch yourself, because your children are watching you, and it's not only your fate, but their fate is going to depend on the state of your heart.
Yes.
It's, again, not just the prophets in a future time, we're going to have plenty to say about a religion that just ticks boxes. It's actually looking for a life that expresses heartfelt obedience.
I think that's a good point, particularly in our family, because there's a bit of talk about here, generational, the children and your grandchildren and so on, is to remember that it's not that we can be a witness, it's that we will be a witness either way.
Yeah, that's right. So the famous words down in verse 16, do not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massah. And this is in the light of the summary of history that they've been given. And they've seen that, okay, when they stray, there is the Lord's discipline, but the Lord is gracious. And they've seen again and again and again that God is willing to forgive and be gracious. But the point here is do not take that for granted.
Yeah.
Right? Like, don't take that for granted. Don't put the Lord your God to the test. Don't keep testing God's patience with you.
And of course, it talks about them inheriting houses that they didn't build and wells that they didn't dig. And important even for us today, I think that sometimes we can misread gifts as entitlement. We're entitled to something. And I think this is kind of saying, hey, we've really got to make sure we interpret our prosperity or any prosperity we may have through gratitude, really.
Yeah, that's right. So the exhortation here, as we're saying, is that a lot of this concern is about the children. So in chapter 6, verse 20, in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you? Tell him. And it's interesting. The question is about the meaning. What is the meaning? And the answer starts with, you were slaves in Egypt. That's the context for this, right? You were once slaves, but the Lord has set you free. And the importance of that answer, this is a very important framing. I think we need to pause here and grasp this, because this is a very important framing of God's commands, right? Basically, the important thing about this, Stu, is that these commands aren't given so that if you follow this, that will earn your status with God. No, the meaning of these is a lot about context. God has saved you from that to something, and this is the thing to which you have been saved, right? From a life in slavery to the principles of this world. I'm sort of alluding to things that Paul said, saving you from subjection to as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, he talks about being in bondage to the ruler of this age, talking about spiritual bondage. So Paul, this is where it's so important to read the New Testament against this backdrop, because a lot of what the Apostle Paul says is just saying exactly this, but in a slightly different way. He talks about them having been dead in transgressions, and God saved them, and he uses Exodus language and saved them from bondage to the ruler of this world, to a different way of life. And this is where it's not like in the Old Testament, salvation was through observing the law, and in the New Testament, it's by grace. No, it was always by grace.
Yes.
And that's the point that is made here, is that you have been saved from something to something. And the law that he's giving is essentially like the rumble strips along the side of the road. It's the boundaries. It marks the road that you're to walk on. Now, the road isn't all about law keeping. The road is a road of the heart, right? It's a heart relationship with God. But the law kind of shows us when we're going astray. So that's the I think the meaning of that, because in verse 25 it says, and if we are careful to obey this law before the Lord our God as he has commanded, that will be our righteousness. And he's not saying that we earn it through keeping the law, but righteousness is about walking with God on that road. We're given access to that road by grace. Okay? So we're put into a right relationship by grace, but that relationship is something we need to walk in and work out and remain in, as Jesus says, remain in me and I will remain in you, Jesus says in John 15. And so that's the idea there, that it's remaining in that right position in relation to God. And indeed, he keeps us in that. Of course, in the light of that then, in order to be this people and to not be enticed into idolatry, and in order to stay faithful, they have to keep themselves separate. Now, this is probably where we come to a difference, because at this stage in the infancy of the nation of Israel, there's almost like a sense in which God puts them in a bit of a humidity crib. When babies, if they're sick or there's something wrong, they get put in a humidity crib, which prevents them from contracting anything, or from, it's kind of
like a bubble.
Yeah, like a bit of a bubble. And essentially, for a while, God wants to put them in a bubble just to protect them. But there's also a sense that the land is going to be a new kind of Garden of Eden. So there's an important prefigurative role prophetic role that the land is going to play. Because at this stage, and I think this is an important way to read the Old Testament narratives, is that Israel, in a sense, is like embodied prophecy. That's important, I think, important to recognize. So we're not just reading history. Once we get to Joshua and we start reading through the stories, it's not just history. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, these stories, this biblical history is referred to as the former prophets. Okay, so there's a prophetic significance that these books have. And so we need to read the story as having a sort of prophetic significance. This is important to say because the invasion of the land can be quite disturbing for us, the edicts to drive out the inhabitants of the land. But this is an important prophetic moment. This is prefiguring. It prefigures judgment, essentially. It prefigures the judgment that's going to come with the ultimate Joshua, Yeshua, who is Jesus, who we read about in Revelation 19, is going to come and essentially wipe the earth of all evil and establish a new heavens and a new earth, a new Eden. But the land of Canaan is to be a kind of provisional new Eden. So yes, the sort of humidity crib, the bubble for the people of God to grow to a point where they can be like the Levites, that kingdom of priests, be scattered amongst the peoples, right? Yes. But not yet, right? They've got to exercise this new way of living amongst themselves. And so there's a one-off element to these edicts to drive the people out of the land. So that the warfare edicts here are unique and locked into this particular prophetic period in time. I say that to prevent any sense that we can just apply this sort of warfare language to whatever we think is a good cause, or no, there's a one-off sense to that moment of coming into the land and occupying the land. It has a very important prophetic significance.
I think it's in line with, in a sense, the first 4 commandments, really, because Canaanite life was pretty cultic, it seems, and it was really important, as you said, to prevent the people from getting drawn into these occultic practices and to reconfigure their worship and manipulate it, which they'd already done really at Kadesh, where they got drawn into idol worship. And so if you read the first 4 commandments that Moses has just reminded them about, it says, now we're going to go to a land that's actually full of this.
Yeah.
We've actually got to clear this out.
Although we need to be careful that we don't apply this in a way that says that therefore as Christians we need to live in complete isolation. Because we are actually called to be dispersed amongst the peoples in a way that these people are not. So I'm trying to point out the uniqueness of this particular time. Because actually all of this still preempts the idea of them being a light to the nations, actually for the sake of the world that this needs to happen right at this point, right?
Yes.
Because in their infancy, they need to be protected. And it's a little bit like the way that we would protect our children from certain... I can remember just turning off the news thinking, this is just a bit much for my kids when they're like 3 and 4 years old.
Yeah, violence or whatever it is. They're not prepared to process that and understand how to process that emotionally.
Yes. So there are certain things that we keep from our kids, things that we learn about later. And I think you need to see this in this way, like the land is acting as this sort of new provisional Eden, a kind of prefiguration of a new heavens and a new earth. And what must not happen is what happened in the Garden of Eden, where, the serpent came in and tempted. And actually what should have happened in the Garden of Eden is Adam should have driven the serpent out, right? He should have subdued, rule and subdue, which he didn't do. And so this is what's going to happen here, is that they've got to drive out the evil influence. And, we see Jesus, in a sense, doing this as the new Joshua. When Jesus comes, the expectation was that he was going to drive out the Romans.
Yes.
But instead what he does, you have repeated instances where Jesus is driving out Satan, like he's driving out demons, essentially. So there's a sense in which when Jesus comes, he identifies who the real enemy is. Right? It's not actually people. We don't fight against people now. We fight for people, and we're fighting against principalities and powers in a spiritual sense. But this is still at work here, Stu, because, as you say, quite rightly, the people in this land are deeply given over to the worst kind of occult practices, including child sacrifice. I mean, the worst. In fact, this is in Genesis 15, when God promises to Abraham that his descendants are going to come into the land, he says to Abraham, it's not going to happen yet. And he says, because the sin of the people in the land, the sin of the Amorites, as he summarily refers to them there, has not yet reached its full measure, right? So he says, I'm going to bring you back in a future age when their sin has reached its full measure. So you've got to imagine right now that judgment is due. God has, in a sense, waited until this people are so far gone, so far entrenched. This is such a spiritual stronghold that it's almost as though God has taken them actually deliberately into the darkest place in the world.
Taking the Israelites
into the darkest place in the world.
To be the light.
To be the light, right? But they've got to drive out the darkness, right? So
that's great. That's good.
That's important preamble to a lot of what we're going to read here, because in chapter 7, we have the first, and there are many exhortations through Deuteronomy, to drive out the nations, right? It says, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them. Show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. And it seems so harsh. But again, this is like, it's the flood against, it's not the flood because it's not universal, but it's preempting final judgment. They are devoted to destruction. There's the important principle of, the Hebrew word is herem, which is almost like a form of, I'm going to cautiously say religious warfare, but it's a unique instance in which a person stands in and becomes the sword of God's judgment. Okay. Yeah. And again, unique to this period, God is calling his people in this unique instance to be the sword of his judgment upon the people in this land. So that's why it has to be that way. Now, and I know there are lots of issues that we could talk about with this, but we're not going to get bogged down into this right now. But the key idea here is holiness. And as it goes through chapter 7, so verse 6, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God, right? The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Now, this also is the background to why it's so important for them to keep their distinctness, because again and again, he warns them, if you become like the nations, right, then you get driven out. Then this is how you get treated, right? Because you come under this judgment. Later on, at the end of the chapter, it's interesting, Stu, that having said that, you're going to drive the people out. He says in verse 22, the Lord your God will drive out these nations before you, little by little. Yeah. You will not be allowed to eliminate them all at once, or the wild animals will multiply around you. Yes, in principle, God is going to drive out all the nations before them, but it's going to happen over time. It's going to happen little by little for very practical purposes. Yeah. Otherwise, the land will be left to ruin. So we come back to this exhortation. So therefore, because of all of this, and again, we have these exhortations, be careful to follow every command I'm giving you today. And again, chapter 8, verse 2, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, right? So here's why you need to be careful, because you need to know what's in your heart. This is, I think, the importance, Stu, for us when we read this. We need to read these stories and see what's in our hearts.
Yeah, totally.
That's what he's saying. So you need to be very, very careful. So therefore, put God's commands even before your own sustenance. And here we get the famous line, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord.
Later in that chapter, verse 11, something that really sort of struck me, be careful that you don't forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commands, the ordinances and statutes I'm giving you today. When you eat and are full and build beautiful houses to live in, and your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold multiply, and everything else you have increases, be careful that your heart doesn't become proud and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery.
Yeah, there's a tragic irony there.
And I feel like that's
going to bless them, but blessing can lead to apostasy.
And it's like we were talking in our sister podcast about the church seems to be the strongest and grow the most when it's struggling, in the world context. It becomes stronger. And I think for all of us, it's, as you often say, the challenge for us is not to become happy with with our God. And in our world we live in today, it's so easy for us to build beautiful houses and have our gold increasing and everything else, and then only really turn to God when we need something fixed.
Yeah, and the tragic irony here is the fact that all of this is going to happen.
That's right.
Because God's going to bless them. But this is where we need to be at our most careful when we have been blessed. As it says in verse 17, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands has produced this wealth for me, right? So we're most in danger when things are going well, when we're prosperous. And, this is again one of the many warnings. So in chapter 9, he points out to them, just know that I'm going to establish you in this land and bless you, and it's not because of your righteousness.
Yes.
Right? It's not because of that. As it says explicitly, verse 5, it is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive out before you. Okay, so I'm driving this people out because I'm wreaking judgment on this people. I'm bringing judgment on this people because of all peoples, they are among the worst. And again, so make sure you don't become like them.
But he's driving them out so that he can keep the promise that he made to his to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
So it's not because of anything you're doing or who you are. It's because of who I am, God, and what I'm doing.
Do you know, I was reflecting on this and thinking, maybe even it's because God had said to Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. There's almost a sense in which, like, Satan, therefore, jumps into that space. Whatever space God says, this is mine, Satan says,
we'll
does
see
the tug of
about
war.
that.
We'll see about that. Because you see that in Job, God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And essentially that's what happens. Satan says, well, we'll see about that. And I think it's almost like this is what has happened because God, says to Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. It's interesting. I mean, this, why this land? This actually becomes a crossroads in the ancient world.
Yeah.
He's putting his people right at the crossroads in the ancient world. But straight away, this then becomes an absolute haunt for
everything evil.
For everything evil. It's like all these demonic forces then cave in on this land because God is laying claim to it.
Yeah.
So. Anyway, and he reminds them in saying it's not because of your righteousness. There's another remember. Just remember the golden calf thing. I was going to reject you then. It was only because Moses pleaded mercy and grace for you that I've spared you. So you wouldn't even be here today, right? Because you haven't been that different from these idolaters in this land. So there's a sobering thought for them as they go in. And so he reminds them of that, including in the start of chapter 10 and how he gave them the law and he recaps all of that. And so he says, and now in verse 12, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God and walk in obedience to him and love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. And the importance of the specific exhortation there, Stu, to fear the Lord your God. And this is essentially, to fear is to have ultimate regard for. Because the temptation is, and it's a very real temptation to be afraid of the power and the influence of these demonic forces, these forces of idolatry in the land. Oh, we're going to have to pay obeisance to this God and that God, and we're going to have to, they're going to feel like sort of frightened essentially into forms of idolatry. And I think this applies so much to us, don't you? Because we can just live out of fear. Like we can sideline our faith in God because we're so afraid of what could happen. And so we run after other things to create our own security and then kind of do God on the side. But God says, no, you have regard for me first. And this is what he's saying here. Fear the Lord your God, right? He is the one that you are to fear. And the offer here is he's saying, if you fear, that is, have absolute regard for me, you're not going to have to fear anything else. So either you live in fear of everything or you fear me and me alone in the positive sense, and you will then fear nothing. That's the offer that he's giving them here.
And I think for us today, even just in one example, the tithe, I think often our propensity is to go, oh, actually, I probably can't really give that this week because I've got this coming up and that coming up and we might have to do this and that and the other with our finances I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And yet God says, no, bring that to me first and I will take care of those things.
He goes on to talk about tithing. And yes, yet again, there's a principle there. Remember, all of this carries through in principle. So that is going to be one of the practical ways of regularly showing this God first thing, as you say. So verse 16, Stu, he says, circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. So there is a indication of what their physical circumcision actually symbolizes, which is a circumcision of the hearts, which is a laying bare of the heart before God. The heart is created for God and for God alone, and he's calling for faithfulness. Now, it's interesting how God portrays himself. For the Lord your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome. He shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. I mean, that's already interesting, because bribing the gods essentially, or trying to pay off the gods and get favor, is very much the way in the ancient Near East. But God's saying, no, you don't do that with me. I am promising something to you.
And then he goes on to sort of anchor Israel's ethics in the subsequent statements about caring for the poor and the widow and the sojourner. And
I mean, this is how God is. This is who I am, right? I defend the cause of the fatherless and the widow. He's talking about himself, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. So he says, and you are to love those who are foreigners. I mean, this is an interesting one, because it would seem to clash with the idea of them driving out the people in the land. But this is, I think, shows that while there is a necessity for clearing out the holiness bubble that they're going to need to live in for a while, the ultimate heart of God is actually for the nations.
Yes.
This is actually why they need to cultivate in this holy place, why they need to cultivate holiness, because God's concern is with the nations. And so here already is an indication to them that, yes, you have received my special favor and special blessing, but it's actually not even just for you.
It's for you to pass on.
It's for you to pass on. It's for the world. And so it's interesting that God, having shown them, I have loved you, he goes on to say, and you were to love those who are foreigners. Why? Because God loves the foreigner residing among you.
And you were once foreigners.
And you were once foreigners, right? So I just think this is a very, very important moment here, Stu. There are these important moments that show us what all of this is about. So like, well, God loves them because there's something special about them, and he hates the nation, he hates everyone else. No, these are moments where we get this context. Okay, for a while, you're going to live in this spiritual humidity crib, and you're gonna cultivate
sort of stoke
holiness.
The fire.
Yeah, that's right.
Get the fire really going,
so you can be a light to the nations. God's heart. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. So that is the importance then of their response, and it is in response to God's grace that they are, as it says at the beginning of chapter 11, love the Lord your God and keep his requirements. Remember today, he said, that your children were not the ones who saw and experienced the discipline the Lord your God is. And he goes through all the things that they saw, reminding them, you're going to need to continually tell these stories to your children. Remember, they weren't there, and this is about protecting the long term, but as we've just said, Stu, it's for the long-term plan.
Yes.
I have a plan for this people, for your children, their children after them. So there's something to preserve here. So ensure, and it's one of the biggest exhortations throughout this book is remember. Yeah. And remembering is a practical thing. We remember by talking about it with our children, by passing this on a generation.
Because they wouldn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, obviously this has been written, but not everyone would have had access to read this. This is a spoken speech that's been later transcribed. Yeah. So the way this was passed on was by conversation.
And reenactment.
And reenactment.
As well. I mean, the festivals were designed to reenact these key events and to become, conversation starters for a therefore, right?
So I guess I'm trying to explain why so much of it's repeated. It's because you've got to remember this is Moses speaking to people who don't have something they can just refer to chapter 3 of verse 6. It's like, no, he's got to keep saying it so they get it right to pass on to the future generation.
Yeah, that's right. Now, at a practical level, when they go into the land, one of the important things that they do, because they're about to go from one way of life, which is essentially nomadic. And remember, when they, marched and when they would encamp, they would encamp around the tabernacle with the tabernacle at the center, right?
Yes.
But they're about to go into a different way of life. So the question is, how is this going to work now? So previously there were very specific instructions about them encamping around the tabernacle with the tabernacle in the center. So in chapter 12, he instructs them that there is going to be one place of worship, right? Don't fragment now. It's important because in the ancient world, ancient cults were invariably tended to be family or clan-based, you know what I mean? So you'd have a family hearth and that would be the worship center of the family, and you would have these kind of clan cults in a sense, and so you would have altars all over the place. Like every clan would have, the highest, basically the highest place within their tribal territory. They would create what are called high places, and there they would have an altar, and that would be like a place of worship, and they would offer to their local tribal god.
Yeah,
and that's what people are doing in the land, and they're going to.
And there would be clan-based deviances from the original because they're all now doing their own thing. So slowly this whole thing's
and that's right. So it fragments. Everyone does as they saw fit. Basically, you know. He says actually in verse 8, "You are not to do as we do here today. Everyone doing as they see fit." Right. Yeah. So basically, what he says there's to be one place of worship. The Lord your God is going to choose a place where He is going to put His name. Now, that's ultimately going to be the temple in Jerusalem. But there's a few different places. I mean, at first, the tabernacle is going to be in Gilgal for a little while during the early stages of Joshua, but it's going to be moved to Shiloh for a number of generations. Shiloh is going to be the place that they're going to come to. Yes. So the point is here, don't reproduce
all over the map.
All over the map, because they're settling. So the concern here is that they fragment, right? You've got to be one united people.
We don't want local shrines. We want one place that everyone comes to together.
We want you to be one united people. I mean, it's good to think about what this means because, again, as I said, all of this carries through, and this concern for oneness, is important, I think, in coming together in an expression of oneness.
Exactly, and I think that's somewhat reflected today in the church as we see it as well. We come together so that we just realign, because if we just lived our lives week to week to week to week without getting together, there's nothing to correct our thinking. There's nothing to bring us back to the main thing being the main thing. We just slowly drift into our own way of what we see as fit. And so, again, this is really what's happening here. Let's not decentralize this and then have everyone making up their own version of what they thought they heard Moses say.
Which will inevitably happen. And it'll happen in response to whatever the
prevailing.
Because there will be already high places and cultic symbols in those set up in those areas, and the likelihood is that they just drift that way towards that. It's not even that they make up their own thing, but they're going to be drawn into these other things. So first of all, there's the Levites that are spread around that are going to point them and repeat these things to them. I mean, that's going to happen. But the regular gatherings at Shiloh, ultimately, and then ultimately, of course, at the temple in Jerusalem, are going to be very, very important habit. Come together regularly. So, and that's going to prevent idolatry. And in chapter 13, you have some, very strong warnings against idolatry. If there's a prophet that says, "Let us follow other gods," get rid of him. If there is, even in verse 6 of verse 13, if your very own brother or your son or daughter or the wife you love or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, "Let us go and worship other gods," you've got to deal with this in the severest terms. It's almost like I hear Jesus saying, in Luke's gospel, unless you hate your mother, your mother and brother and sisters, and he's not saying we should hate our mother and brother and sisters. He's pointing to the inevitability of the fact that family loyalty could easily draw us away when our family are pagans or anti our faith, that they will become, as unfortunate that is, they may become our enemies, and you don't pander to that. You know what I mean? This is all part of putting God first, even above family loyalties. That's Jesus' point there.
Yeah. And I think also for me, that's
the point here.
Yeah, that's also hit home to me in a way that says, in relative terms, the amount of love you have for God, it should feel like, in comparison, you hate your mother, your brother, your sister, because the difference should be so great. And yet, I think too often we're willing to sacrifice what we should be doing for God or giving to God because of family. Now, I'm not saying that's, we should ignore our families, but it's like God's trying to say, you need to understand, I'm above even the thing you think you love the most. I'm so much.
Yeah, and in fact, loving God first is what truly enables us to love others as we should, of course. Yeah. And then in verse 12, if you hear it said in one of the towns the Lord your God is giving you, troublemakers have arisen. So he's talking about a case in which a whole town basically decides, right, we're going to worship
something else.
Other gods. Then the town gets destroyed. Basically, what it means is that town is to be treated like the inhabitants of Canaan, like the Canaanites, and they come under that harem, that devoted to destruction category, that devoted to complete destruction category that the Canaanites uniquely were under. So we start getting from these warnings, Stu, we start moving into more practical exhortations, and we get a repetition of the laws that are going to help to ingrain this sense of difference. We start with a repetition of food laws. Well, interestingly, one of the first things here is a warning against taking on the funeral rites, actually, of the people in the land, which is chapter 14, verse 1.
Yeah.
You are the children of the Lord your God. Very important statement, actually, there, Stu. You are the children of the Lord your God. So, do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples of the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasure possession. So there are certain sort of cultic practices associated with funeral rites, and you're not to partake in that. And then it's interesting the way that goes into various food laws. Essentially, this is a repeat of what we perhaps dragged ourselves through in the book of Leviticus, but there's a repeat of that.
It's a reminder.
And again, it's a continual reminder.
We feel like it's a repeat, but we've got to remember they can't refer back to something. He's having to say it again because he wants them to remember.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have this law of tithes, Stu. Be sure to set aside a tenth, and the word tithe basically means a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Now, if I can just explain this, Stu, there are actually slightly different forms of tithes.
Right.
There were actually two different forms of tithe. One was a tithe to the Levites in your towns, which maintained
the local priestly kind of.
So the principle, and I think it's important that we grasp the principle of the tithe, because invariably it's principles that carry over. Okay. And the principle of the tithe is, first of all, it's going to be the practical necessity that will ensure that the biblical faith is going to be preserved among them. So you preserve the Levites are to be spread among the people. They're like the pastors in a sense.
Yes.
They are going to be spread out among the people. They are the ones that officiate in the towns, and they're meant to be teaching the people and so forth. And so they are to be maintained. The Levites, because they don't have their own land, they're to be scattered amongst the people. The Levites themselves actually pay a tithe on the tithes, and they pay that to the priests who are serving in the temple.
Yep.
So this principle of tithing is about preserving a sort of centralized worship that brings people back to God. It's to support the ministries of the Levites in teaching and administering the worship. So that's the first kind of tithe. Then the other tithe is the one that's brought to the tabernacle that you bring to the Lord, and you share it there in His presence. Yeah. Like it becomes a communal meal in a sense that it's not about giving away, it's something to share, and the idea of sharing is important. And then every third year, that sharing tithe is to be distributed amongst the poor. So there's a provision here for the poor as well. There's to be, let's call it an overflow to look after those who are in need.
Yeah.
So this is the principle that in Acts chapter 2 and again in Acts chapter 4, when the Christian community is described, Luke alludes, he basically takes the principles here and shows how, as a result of the outpouring of the Spirit of God, this very principle is being fulfilled as the fruit of the Spirit, as it were. Because it says, yeah, you know what I mean? So that's the importance of that section. It says there that they shared everything they have. And the The word in Greek share is the word koinos. It means to share. And what it did, it created a fellowship. It created a togetherness. And the word there is koinonia. Okay, that's a kind of word that describes what was, because they shared koinos, they created koinonia, which is fellowship. So that's what's behind, that's the principle that's behind this law, is to share 10% of your income in order to create fellowship.
Yes.
So it's not about you just giving it to whoever you want.
Yeah.
The sharing part, bringing it together into one space to maintain the worship and to maintain that sort of centralized hub where people come together and can be taught and so forth.
And the poor can be looked after from that
that's
as well.
Right, and the poor can be looked after from that. And it creates a common purse for a common purpose.
Yeah. So this is the difference between, let's say, tithes and free will gifts. So if we chose to give to some external mission organisation, which is great, we absolutely would want to support that, that's a different thing to the tithe, which is to come to the fellowship, as you say, to create that community and enable that community. Yeah,
that's right. Now, I mean, and I think it's important to point out this, because there are some people that say, oh, no, tithing is just an Old Testament law. Now, for a start, that's problematic, because Jesus says, I've not come to abrogate the law, right, but to fulfill it. And actually what Luke is showing in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, because it actually says there were, it talks about them sharing, and then it says there were no needy persons among them. And it's so explicit the way that he's putting that. It all refers back to this to show that this fulfills the law, right?
Yeah, right.
And here's the thing, under a new covenant, and this is the important thing, because we can say, oh, that was an Old Testament thing, so we don't need to do that. But the thing to point out is new covenant commitment is never less than Old Covenant commitment.
Yeah, right.
It's never less, right? So the interesting thing that Luke does is that he shows that they gave 100%, right? Now, in Paul's letters, he talks to the churches, when he writes to the churches, he talks about them, giving in accordance with their income and so forth. And he's a Hebrew thinker, right? So he's thinking percentage there. So the principle of tithing, it's actually essential that that's carried through, because if the principle of tithing is not carried through, and remember, okay, you might say, okay, we don't follow a law of tithing as such. No, but we do carry through the principle.
Yeah.
And the way I would put that is at least 10%, because it's never less.
Yeah.
We carry through the principle, and the principle is that we share koinos in order to create koinonia, fellowship. Otherwise, it's all just individualistic. I think this imperative to still create this centralized, unified expression is just as even more critical now, as we are scattered amongst the peoples. Yeah. It's even more critical that we do this now than it was then. So in chapter 15, and we'll finish with this, Stu,
sounds good
today, but we have a reminder of these laws around cancelling debts. And the idea of this, again, they're going into the land, and they're going to have property. Okay. Now, some people are going to do better than others.
Yep.
Okay. So it's inevitably going to happen that some people will become more wealthy than others, and others could fall into debt, which means that they would fall into debt slavery, which means that they would have to
work to pay off what they have.
Yeah, work to pay off their own, even sell off their land. Now, I mean, the year of Jubilee, and after 49 years, is designed so that all land is returned to its, basically everything resets and everyone goes back to their traditional allotment. But at the end of every 7 years, debts were to be cancelled to ensure that you didn't end up with a heavily classed society where you have very poor and very rich. Now, there's a realism about that because, he says in verse 11, there will always be poor. On the one hand, do this to prevent
or to minimize it.
Yeah. Well, I think the heart of God is to
prevent it.
This is the thing about the law here, is that there's a realism about this. There's a sense in which I want to prevent this, cancel debts, share, all of these principles are there. However, I know your hearts. I know the hearts of people. There are going to be poor people among, and partly because there are going to be people that just continually squander, or that think Proverbs. There's continually going to be people who
wasteful,
wasteful or whatever. But then there are also going to be people who, through no fault of their own, I mean, maybe their house burns down, or they experience various misfortunes or disease or whatever, and that becomes an opportunity actually for the community to come in and help them.
Yeah.
Right? And he's saying this is the kind of community that I want you to be, is a community that is generous and that looks after the poor. So verse 10, give generously to them, that is the poor, and do so without a grudging heart.
Yeah.
Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in your work and in everything you put your hand to, right? There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy.
And that, I think, speaks back to this whole thing where God previously was saying through Moses, in your fullness, don't take pride as though you got that and it belongs to you. It's been given to you as a gift. Your success, your fruitfulness, your blessing is so that you can bless others.
Yeah, that's right. So along with this, along with every 7 years, debts are forgiven. Therefore, actually, for debt is forgiven, then also debt slavery is. So someone who is in, and again, slavery, we're not thinking, slavery like, 17th to 19th century forms of slavery, where ancients, this is bond service essentially. In the 7th year, that slaves are to go free.
Yeah.
And it says here, and when they go free, do not send them away empty-handed.
Yes.
Supply them liberally as they go. Again, because God is concerned. And he reminds them, because just remember, you were slaves and I supplied you liberally. So, Stu, that's the good setup, I think, for the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. In the next episode, we're going to take this right to the end. This is God creating a distinct people who are going to exhibit to a watching world a new way of living. This is a big step forward.
A very counter-cultural way of living.
A very, very counter-cultural way of living. So they're going to really need to stick to this, because the tendency is that they're going to get drawn into the ways of the world, right? They are, as Paul said, not to be conformed to the pattern of this world, right? But to offer themselves completely to God and to worship Him and Him alone. And that is something that we still need to hear today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.